Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, Using Digital Validation to Unlock CSA's Benefits. My name is Sinead Quinn and I will be your webinar host today. We will get to as many questions as we possibly can at the end, but if we do run out of time, we will follow up with you directly, or feel free to send questions in to info@kneat.com. With that, let's jump in. Next slide. Yeah, using digital validation to unlock CSA's benefits. So on the screen, you'll see our copyright and disclaimer statement, and we leave this on the screen for you for a moment so that you can read through. So today's speaker, we'd like to introduce you to Darren Geaney, our Process Engineer, Computer Software Assurance SME.
Hi everyone, you're all very welcome to this webinar, and thank you Sinead for the kind introductions. So I suppose, to cut a long story short, we're all here today to learn a bit more about CSA and how CSA can be implemented, how CSA can be implemented in a digital environment, and kind of a brief history of time of why CSA was developed. So what we'll do is start off, we go through the agenda for the webinar and we'll work from there. Again, any questions and queries, as Sinead pointed out, you can always send those in during the actual webinar itself, and we'll answer as many as we can. Those we can't answer, we'll always come back to help whenever we can. So I'll just go on to the next slide. So what we're going to cover today is like basically what you need to know about CSA. You know, what are the common pain points of the current CSV process? You know, why was CSA developed? Why did for some reason somebody decide to go with CSA? We'll look through the traditional validation approach. We look through the CSA guidance benefits and the intended uses. Again, what do we have the intended use for? What are the benefits of CSA? We look at feature risks and system risks. You know, how do we break down system into features? You know, how do we assess features? You know, why do we assess features? You know, are they different, etc. We talk about test evidence and the appropriate level of testing required based on the risk associated with, say, with those features or the system itself. We talk then briefly about risk-based approaches and how CSA is essentially looking at the risk, why it's all about risk, essentially, to my mind. That's the way I understand it, is we're looking at something, we're testing it appropriately because it has a certain level of risk. Okay, and then we take the appropriate testing approach for that. And then we briefly go through a case study where a customer using some of the Kneat technology that we have deployed Kneat and took the CSA approach and the benefits that they found from not only taking the CSA approach, but also from digitizing their system. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll go on to the first part, which is what we need to know about CSA. But I've been told that I sometimes talk very quickly, so if anyone is not understanding what I'm saying, or I'm speaking too quickly, please mention it in the questions and I will slow down my level of speech. It's just I tend to talk rather quickly. So let's go on to the first thing. What do we need to know about CSA? Okay, so computer software assurance comes from a multi-year collaboration between FDA and industry, and this is vitally important. This wasn't something foisted upon the industry by the FDA or any other regulatory body. It was a multi-year collaboration because the FDA they make sure that we manufacture product that's safe for use for the patient, and that we safe for use for everybody else who wants to use it. So that's very important. It wasn't foisted upon. It was based on the experience of people who work in the industry, who regularly work in the industry, and that's vital. So it identified common pain points, and the FDA's current thinking puts patient safety and product quality at the heart of the risk assessment process. Essentially, what the FDA want to do is that to make sure that any product that went out was safe for the patient. And if it's safe for the patient, the product quality then as well. So we need to look at the patient. It's centered around the patient. They're the person taking the drug. They're the person using the medical devices they need to. And that's the person we think about. Nobody wants to put out something that's going to hurt anyone. We all come in to do a good day's work. Everybody wants to be the best we can. So we looked at these, and these are some points that we looked at. So they're essentially 5, right? So the first point there is risk is based on the impact of patient safety and product quality measured against requirement complexity. So what it means by that is if I have a requirement that's particularly complex, or a requirement to control a parameter in a process, say a critical to quality parameter or a critical to process parameter, I want to make sure that I'm testing that at an appropriate level. I want to make sure that I'm giving more time to that particularly complex requirement, and the less complex requirements and the requirements that have less impact to product quality and patient safety, I then take a slightly less detailed testing approach on that, and we'll come across those in the slides later on. Okay, So the second point then is it calls for the least burdensome documentation approach. That's been in the FDA guidance for as long as I've been involved in the medical device and pharmaceutical industry. You don't need to create documentation just for the sake of it. You're just generating documentation to make the auditor happy, not necessarily make sure you test the product correctly, test the most riskiest features of the product, test the riskiest features of the medical device adequately. We just created loads of documentation. So it calls for the least burdensome approach. Now, it can reduce paperwork by 80% with unscripted and ad hoc testing. So unscripted and ad hoc testing is something we'll cover later on, but it essentially means that unscripted testing is I'm testing a particular feature or a particular system because it's less risky in a different way than I would if it was a high risk feature or a high risk system. And we'll come to that later on. And ad hoc testing is a similar thing. That basically we're depending on the tester who has the knowledge of the system, knowledge of the process, knowledge of the piece of software essentially, to make sure I'm testing it adequately because we identify something as low risk. And we'll come to that later on. So point 4 is it results in less issues encountered in production. So how does it do that? So it does that because we're testing the riskiest, most complex features adequately. We're concentrating really on those because they're the ones that would probably give us a problem along in the production line. And as we're producing product, if we don't concentrate on those at the start, we'll end up seeing issues down the line. And the last part, which is very important, is that it's FDA and ISPE supported. So again, the practitioners, the day-to-day people who make sure that the companies that they work for meet the regulations, both are on board with this. It's very important that both are on board because it basically is a realization that like nobody knows everything. The consultation is always a better approach to kind of implementing CSA and development of CSA. So what we'll do is we'll just go on to some of the common issues people have with the current CSV approach and, kind of a background of why CSA was developed essentially. So what are the common pain points? So it generates substantial amounts of documentation. Why does it do that? Because we don't take a risk-based approach. Their process says I create 14 documents regardless of how risky the system is or the level of risk a particular feature is. Okay, I'm going to create those 14 documents for no reason other than the fact the SOP tells me, and I'm not thinking about where I should concentrate my testing, which leads on to point 2, doing things for the auditor without thinking. My SOP says I need to have 14 documents. I'm going to create my 14 documents, whether they're needed or not. I'm going to test everything the exact same way, whether that be the lowest risk function or the highest risk function of a particular system. Again, I'm not really thinking. I'm just doing things because I'm being told I have to by my SOP. I'm not concentrating where I need to make sure I'm getting the best bang for my buck in terms of testing, validation, documentation, etc. We've all seen number 3, test scripts that run into several pages. Personally, I've seen ones that run into over 100 pages for particular features. Again, we're taking the same approach. We're just saying every part of the system is equally as risky as every other part. And we all know well that that's not the case. An example would be like you would test the user manual the exact same way as you test a feature that controls a critical quality parameter. Now, what's more important, the user manual, which you could test probably briefly, or the one that you want to make sure that this particular feature controlling a particular parameter actually works? I want to concentrate on that, but we test them the same at the moment, right? And it's really strange the way we do it that way. Now, point 4 is that it takes too long to validate. Everybody has always said that to me. I'm a former validation engineer, former software quality engineer. It takes too long to perform dry runs as opposed to testing the system. The FDA and everybody else in the regulatory world believes that dry runs don't exist. That's not the case. How often have we asked people to dry run your protocol? We come back with 15 typos. God, what a waste of time. I've got 15 typos. I haven't really tested anything in my dry run. I've just found out that, yes, it will pass. I'm not concentrating on the testing. I'm more interested in the content of the protocol than what I'm actually testing. Okay, and the 5th one is addressing test script errors and associated time and cost impacts, which goes back to number 4. I'm taking a script, I'm dry running it multiple times to make sure when I officially run it, it passes. Again, what a huge waste of time. I'm really just testing something here for the sake of it, testing that the test step is written correctly, no matter how risky the feature is or no matter what little risk associated with the feature there is. Okay, so that's kind of the pain points that we all know. So we just go down to the last part here then as well. We just look about the traditional CSV approach that we currently still know about, right? So let's say, for example, we're implementing a software system to drive efficiency and quality improvements. Okay, What do we currently do at the moment? Okay, we currently have multiple test cases for each requirement. We all do that at the moment, right? We have multiple dry runs. Again, waste of time, waste of money, waste of effort. I'm just verifying that it will pass. And that's what I'm concentrating on. Remember, I'm a validation engineer. I've been told I have to pass it by Friday. So you get an awful lot of protocol generation errors, typos, little things like that, that really, it's kind of like death by 1,000 cuts. It really takes time to get these addressed. Like every typo will take time to document, will take time to fix, will take time to re-execute in some cases. Essentially, then it all drills down to one formal test execution when we probably had 2 to 3 possible, even more dry runs, because we want to make sure it facts. And we come up to the auditor and we say, ta-da, we have found 0 defects. Why? Because we ran the protocol possibly twice, possibly 3 times, possibly more. And aren't we all very good boys and girls that we've now found no defects in our perfectly executed protocol, and we're testing everything to the same level. Okay, so you can see here that what we're concentrating on here at the top of the triangle is the documentation. That's what we're looking to prove. Again, we're looking to prove to the auditor that we can show that we've done everything exactly as our SOP says. We have loads of testing activities for everything. Okay, we test everything the same. We have a good level of assurance that we think that we know the test script is passed. Again, a test script is passed. But in terms of critical thinking, in terms of are we testing the right things to the right level, to the right degree, it's at the bottom of the triangle. We're generating tests and protocols, validations to prove that we can do that. We haven't proved anything, or we haven't shown that we're testing adequately. So again, if you go to the bullet points on the right, is critical thinking isn't really applied. We're just doing it because we're told we have to do it because our SOP says to do it. Every feature is tested the same. As I said, whether it's the user manual or a really critical feature that controls critical to quality or critical to process parameter, we test everything the same. And it's a very arduous documentation approach. We're just generating pages and pages of documentation. We've all had a way where we've gone in the event of an audit and we've 15, 20 folders of paper. And it's like, everything's tested the same way. So that's why we have these amount of paper. So the way it was looked at is that there had to be a better way to do this, right? There has to be a better way than just generating this amount of documentation. And what I might add as well is the environmental impact of paper. I mean, paper costs. Ink is very expensive. You have to buy a printer, and print. If you're testing everything the same way, you're creating hundreds of pages. So that's the current system as it is. And again, so looking again between the FDA and industry, they realize that, look, there has to be a better way to do this. So if we go on to the next slide, we'll see we have the CSA guidance benefits, right? Now, the first thing you can immediately see is that the triangle has been inverted. What's the most important thing in this? The most important thing in this is critical thinking. Okay, the critical thinking here is that I need everybody who's an expert in this in my organization, firstly looking at the features, or firstly looking at the system, what's the risk associated with the system to the product quality and the patient, and then let's look at the features and the process. Let's look at the features and the software that's going to control the process, and let's look at what we need to test first. So let's look at the most risky parts, the most complicated parts of the system that we need to test. Let's concentrate our testing there. No, we look at the system in a whole, but that's essentially what this is saying. The most important part here is the heavy lifting, and it's always done at the start. What's the most important? What's the high risk features? Then we look at the assurance needs and the testing activities, and you can see the last one then is the documentation. So we're actually thinking about what we need to look at. Okay, you can see here in the diagram, it says, we focus on the high risk parts of the system. More time is spent on challenging the system, and this results in an implementation timeline that's significantly reduced, right? So again, we're looking at the most important risky parts. That's where we're doing our traditional detailed testing as we speak. You have your test step, you have your expected result, you have your pass fail, right? We focus the high risk features on that. So instead of just generating documentation for everything, every feature, because that's what we have to do, we particularly concentrate on those, and we do this a very high level rigor of testing on those particularly high risk features. Now, how you define your high risk features, guidance is given in the FDA document, and also there's GAMP second edition that you can look at for examples. Again, every company will be different, but it's the approach and the methodology that the FDA want people to use. We want to really focus on the high risk features. So again, if we look to the right of that, we have no detailed test scripts for lower risk features. Again, I've got a user manual. Do I need a 10-page test script to show the user manual is correct? I probably don't, because it's low risk. It's not going to impact the patient. It's not going to impact the quality. Let's test the appropriate level. Okay, so you get 60% faster protocol generation and execution, because I'm not creating all these huge details for low risk features. I can generate protocol faster, execute it faster, and I'm really concentrating on the value add activities here. I'm looking at the riskier features, looking at those, challenging those, because we said in the previous slide, if you challenge at the start, when you go into production, those features that can possibly cause an issue have been really in-depthly tested. So if we apply the new guidance, we end up leveraging a lot of what the vendor does, right? So if we create, if we're bringing in a system and it's supplied to us by a vendor, now always remember, a vendor can be an internal vendor. It could be a department inside in your company. It could be like you could have your own IT department. You could have your own engineering department. They're still a vendor. They're still supplying you. So again, what CSA wants to do is to leverage the vendor, what the vendor has done. So if a vendor has created all the validation documentation, including the testing, let's leverage that. Let's use that. So you've audited the vendor. You're happy enough with their quality system. You're happy enough with what they've done with the system. How do I use that? Let's leverage that. Let's leverage all that they've done and say, right, we're happy with the vendor. They're ISO 9001 qualified. We're happy with their quality system. We've done an audit. We've looked at their testing. We're happy enough. Right, we're going to use that. There's no use us reinventing the wheel. It's a waste of time. You're spending money for no reason. You're spending time for no reason. So again, it's a risk-based evaluation. So we're looking at the riskier features. We're looking at all the features, but we're concentrating our effort on the riskier features. It streamlines testing again, because we're looking at basically the riskier features, how I can test this, where I can test it, kind of when I can test it. And the last one then is it's based on the intended use of the computerized system. So risk should dictate the process of determining the system validation approach, and this risk determination should establish a commensurate level of validation effort. Essentially, in a nutshell, what that means is that if I bring in a system, I need to define my intended use for that system, okay? Based on that, I'll have a certain level of risk associated with that system. That will drive me down a certain path in terms of what I need to do. And then it can be further broken down into the features associated with that system, what level of effort I need to do on those particular features that are in the system. Okay, so I'll go on to the next slide here, but that's essentially it in a nutshell. Think before you act. Think of the high risk features, classify them accordingly, make sure you're happy with those, with the documentation and the level of effort that you have from the vendor. Use that and make sure that when you stand in front of an auditor or stand in front of your own quality department, you can stand over what you've done. Okay, but you're basically concentrating on the higher risk features. So if I go on to the next slide. So, so critical thinking, where did this critical thinking come out of? Okay, I'll just go through a few things here in terms of critical thinking. So this is from the ISP EGAM 5, risk-based approach to compliant GXP computerized systems. So critical thinking promotes informed decision-making and good judgment on where and how to apply and scale quality and compliance activities for computerized systems. Point number 2, critical thinking should be applied to understand the implementation risks as well as functional risks to patient safety, product quality, and data integrity. And third point, regulators look for scaled paperwork with well-organized information and records that have an appropriate level of detail, supported by clear and unambiguous rationales explaining critical thinking applied. Essentially, what this means is that you have thought about the process that this particular piece of software or this particular software system is going to help you implement. Where is the riskier parts of the system? How did I determine that this is a high risk feature or this is a high risk system versus this is a low risk feature or this is a low risk system? And can I stand over that? Can I stand in front of an auditor and say, yeah, we determined that this feature was high risk using these criteria that we've agreed in our company, and that followed the FDA methodology and the FDA guidance on CSA. And again, the last part then is, regulators look for scaled paperwork and well-organized information and records that have an appropriate level of detail. Again, CSA does not mean you do not generate documentation. It means you generate the appropriate level of documentation based on the risk. Specifically, the big change being to the testing documentation, which we come to later on, which we have traditional old school testing versus ad hoc versus unscripted testing. And we look to that, okay? So I'll just go on to the next slide. Just a few more points on critical thinking. And just one last point before we move on. GAMP 5, which is a very, very useful guide. Again, it's very useful because it shows you, it gives good guidance on how to implement how to meet the regulations. This has an entire chapter on critical thinking, and it's chapter 20. So again, it's a very good source of information. So critical thinking and why. So again, from the critical thinking, the GAMP 5 guidance is the evaluation of risk equality should be assessed on scientific knowledge and ultimately linked to the protection of the patient. And the level of effort for managing documentation of the quality risk management process should be commensurate to the level of risk. Again, we're putting the patient at the center of the process here, right? So you're applying a documented risk-based approach to ensure the computer system fulfills the validation requirements of 21 CFR Part 82070-I, which essentially means that if I use a particular piece of software in an automated process, I validate it, and I validate the appropriate level of risk using an established protocol, and these shall be documented. Okay, that's essentially what this means. Now, I've just mentioned the 21 CFR 820.70I regulation, right? One thing we need to make sure that we come away from this is that CSA does not change any regulations. It's a different way to implement a validation approach to make sure that you still reach, sure that your company still reach and implement and meet the requirements of those regulations. Okay, so that's basically what it's a different approach. Regulations haven't changed, but we just want to make sure that we still meet and make sure that we attain and are aligned with those particular regulations. Okay, so the last point in this is that in the context of computerized systems, scientific knowledge is based upon the system specifications and the business process being supported. This isn't the case of a kind of a scattergun approach where you say, I think this is a low risk system because it's Friday and I don't really want to test it to a high level of degree. Not that I'm saying that happens in the real world, but I'm kind of joking about that. But what you need to do is you need to have a system set up whereby you're looking, you basically change your mindset from document centric to process centric, okay, to patient centric and quality centric. What I mean by that is that you currently have a CSV process that will say, I need to do all these documents, and you're not really thinking. And I'll do my dry runs, and I'll make sure my dry runs pass, so that when I come to my final full official execution, I have 0 deviations and all my tests pass, right? You're taking it from that sort of approach, which isn't a huge amount of thinking, to say, right, what's the riskiest part of this system? I should be concentrating my tests here based on this set of criteria of how this feature works. If something goes wrong with this feature, how could that impact the product quality or the patient? So that's what we're thinking of. It is, CSA is a mindset change, and it's not something that will happen overnight. It's something that takes time, with training, again, it's a different mindset change. So it's something to be cognizant of and think of when you're actually talking about CSA and looking to implement CSA into your business. And that's why the term critical thinking has been used, and it does have its own individual chapter in GAMP guidance. And again, it will come with time. It's just a matter of changing your mentality a little bit. So I'll just go on to the next one. So we just go on now to the intended use of what we define as our intended use for CSA. So again, we all know these, right? When we're creating an intended use for a system, we ask ourselves a couple of questions, right? So what, why, who, and when, what's the system, why is it needed, who's going to use it, when's it going to be used? Does it provide equipment control? Does it automatically pass fail a manufactured item? They could be like, that's a pretty high risk system. Like if something automatically makes a pass or a fail determination, or a feature makes a pass or a fail determination, I'd say that is fairly risky. I'd be looking to myself to go, right, if that's what this part of the system is doing, I want to make sure that I test that correctly. So I would see that as pretty high risk. So the next one then would be regulations, right? So again, you have 820.72, inspection, measuring, and test equipment. Okay, you 21 CFR 820, automated process, 21 CFR Part 11, etc. Let's say, for example, I'm running a particular system, and it requires me to record my initial and date electronically. So I need to put in my user ID and my password for that particular system. It records that somewhere on a database, right? So let's think about that from a CSA perspective. If that particular part of the app doesn't work correctly, right? No, I'm purely thinking of the patient and the quality, the effect on the patient and the effect on the quality of the product. If that doesn't work correctly, that's not going to affect the customer, patient. It's not going to affect the quality of the product. No, it will affect my data integrity. It will affect if I have to do a recall, for example. but that's not necessarily high risk. You know, how deep do I want to test that? Is it a medium risk? It could even be a low risk. You know, these are things you kind of look at. And the last one then would be user interfaces. You know, I remember working at a time and we had the test written. We'd have a user interface, and in the test it would specify what we expected to see on the screen. Thinking back on it now, it's madness. We had pages of that going, verify this button appears on screen, verify that button appears on screen, rather than testing what the actual user interface is supposed to do. Again, that could be low risk, because if that doesn't work right, I can't log in, or the user interface doesn't work correctly. You know, is that a high risk feature? Probably not. You know, but again, it's just something we need to look at. And the one thing I'll say is that the manufacturer is always responsible for the intended use. It's not the vendor. The vendor will have its own intended use of a system that they're going to supply to you. But from a manufacturing perspective, from an auditing perspective, you need to define your own intended use. But that's standard. I just want to repeat that. No, that's the way it is. So we go on quickly and we talk about system and feature risks. So what we have here is the FDA represents process risk in the CSA guidance as a kind of a binary manner. It's either not high risk or it's high risk, right? It's one of the two. Now, in reality, we know that you're going to have high risk, medium risk, and low risk. That's just the way the world works. We're not going to have something that's really, really high and really, really low. So the FDA acknowledges that the risk associated with the software used as part of production or the quality system, they're really on a spectrum. And the manufacturer should determine the risk for each software feature, function, or operation as the risk falls on that spectrum. Again, and it depends on the intended use of the software. Okay, comes down to the intended use. Is that feature going to be high risk to the patient or to the quality of the product? You know, the starting point is the intended use. So the FDA really, it's primarily concerned with those evaluated as a high risk process, right? Now, they will want to see that you have a system in place that allows you to based on a scientific approach and based on knowledge of the process, to determine which is high risk and which is not high risk. But in reality, it's a spectrum. They will concentrate on the high risk ones because that's their concern, the ones that can impact the patient and the quality of the product. Okay, a manufacturer can still determine that a process risk is, it's, for example, moderate or intermediate, or even low. In such cases, portions of the CSA guidance relating to not high process would apply. So if you've got something that's a moderate or a low impact, really from the CSA guidance there, that's where the not high risk process kind of parts would apply. Okay, and that's just something to think about. But again, if we look at here, we have the non-high risk feature. It indirectly impacts product quality or human safety, or it's required for regulatory compliance. Again, by 21 CFR Part 11, I'm not going to injure a patient if I don't record my ID correctly, or it doesn't get saved on the server immediately, for example. But the high risk features would directly impact product quality or human safety and potentially cause or impede a product recall. So again, think about it. I mean, the second point there, I'm not really impacting the quality of the product, but again, if I do impact the quality of the product, it can cause a recall, which would cost me a lot of money, reputational damage. It's not going to be worth it if you don't concentrate your testing where it should be. Now, GAMP5 does mention data integrity, but the FDA doesn't explicitly mention it, right? A lot of companies would look at data integrity, things like your records that are recorded as part of the process, that they could view those as high risk, and that's completely up to you as an organization. Again, the FDA is focused on product quality and patient, but if you determine that your data integrity is a high risk feature and you test it in scripted testing really intently, then that's up to you. It really is, and you need to make that determination yourself. It's a bit of a hot topic in pharma, data integrity, but it's slightly different in Part 11. There is a little bit of overlap, but what I'd say is that when you're generating your documentation, this is from a personal perspective, is that every system should have some sort of data flow diagram, which kind of shows the checks and balances of the data flow to make sure that data isn't being changed or manipulated while it's being sent from system A to system B. Like a good example, if you're transferring something onto a SaaS system, where is the pinch points? Where does the data get transferred from point A to point B? How often does it get transferred? Is it every 15 seconds it takes data, or is it every 5 seconds? And could it be intercepted? Could it be changed? That sort of stuff. So again, audit trails, they can be reviewed regularly, and we'd see those as kind of more of medium to low risk. But that's really what the FDA kind of look at it again. It's going to be on a spectrum, but the FDA views it as kind of binary. So if you go on to the next one, now we'll just look at a kind of a breakdown to the testing approaches that this new CSA guidance kind of gives us. So again, high risk features, we're talking really about things that will be tested in a kind of the current manner that we do, where we have all the detail and all the expected results, to the other with distance, the other types, which would be unscripted and ad hoc. So what we have really then is we have a look at this here. Now, this is just my interpretation of it, is that we have an associated risk level. We have an associated testing approach and the kind of foreseen percentage of testing that you're going to be using based on these approaches. So if you see here on the left, we have high risk features. So these would be, that would be scripted testing. That would be our traditional test scripts that we see at the moment. We have our detailed test steps, we have our expected result, we have our pass fail, we add in our attachments, etc. And again, what would it apply to, automatically pass or fail a manufactured item, for example? We see that as being maybe 5% of the testing that you should be doing. So you can see here there's a massive change from the user manual, which took the same level of testing, same level of detail, to 5%, because we're looking at the features, and it estimates that about 5% of the features will be high risk features. It will change depending on your system, but it's not going to be 100%, shall we say. And then we have non-high risk features, which we'd use for maybe unscripted testing and ad hoc testing, which we'll go into in a minute. But let's say, for example, unscripted testing would be ERES, so your electronic records and electronic signature features. I'm going to test those using unscripted testing, which is essentially a not very detailed level of testing, though you do need to provide some guidance to the tester when they're doing the test, but it's not as detailed as scripted testing, which is your traditional testing, which is you will do this, you will do that, and you will see this. So the estimate of that is about 70%. And the last one then is ad hoc testing. So for example, the user interface. Again, ad hoc testing essentially says that I trust the tester to basically write the test case because it's a low risk feature. It probably doesn't have minor or no impact whatsoever on the quality of the product or the patient. So I'm going to trust my testers who are trained. I've brought them in, I've trained them up. I want to make sure they do that testing correctly, and they can follow the ad hoc approach. And that's seen as saying about 25% of the testing. As you can see already, there's going to be a massive change in the mindset to how you test something like this. But again, you can see the savings there immediately. I mean, high risk features, traditional testing, it's 5%. There's a massive change there. So what we'll do is we just go through some examples of scripted, unscripted, and ad hoc testing, just so you can have an idea of what they can look like for your organization, right? So we'll go through the scripted testing. Now, this is our traditional testing, right? So we have a traditional testing approach. You can see here, you've got your test instruction, you've got your expected result, pass fail, who performed it, okay? Now, what you have up here as well as your specification reference, you still need traceability to all your testing, right? So whether it's scripted, unscripted, or ad hoc testing, you still need to show, and we all need to do this to an auditor, to your quality group, that every requirement that I've detailed that needs to be tested is tested somewhere and is tested to the appropriate level. So if a feature is a high risk feature, right, I'm going to take this approach. I'm going to cross-reference back to my requirements here. That's essentially what this is. You still need to maintain that traceability. So if we go in here, we still have our detailed test steps, okay? Screenshots may not be required, but we still include who performed the test and the date of the execution. We're still following the core principles here. Who performed the test, when they did it. It's contemporaneous, it's accurate. But you'll see here that, now in this example, we're not really recording any screenshots. Screenshots are great, but only record a screenshot when you need to. I mean, I've worked in previous companies where we had screenshots for everything. I mean, a screenshot to my mind is that you don't trust the tester to record what they've seen accurately. No, some cases you'll need them, some cases you won't. Okay, so that's your traditional scripted testing, right? So let's go to the next one, which is unscripted testing. So you can see here, it establishes a high-level test plan objectives. You can see that there's no step-by-step test procedure script required. This is not as detailed. It's not do this, do this. It's usually a single statement, verify that this has worked against an asset that can be created, okay? You still have your pass-fail, you still have your performed by, you still have your cross-reference back. Again, it's not as detailed as your scripted testing because in this case, it could be used for a low risk or a medium risk feature, okay? But again, we're still following our core principles here, that who performed the test as well. So that's unscripted testing, right? And again, you can see here, it's just a scenario. It's not, I want to see this. Has this happened? Yes. The last one then, which is ad hoc testing. Okay, there's no pre-approved test scripts. You can see here, this is blank. Now we're just using the term scenario here, right? That's basically all it means. A case of that the tester at the time they're running the test actually writes in what they did because this is a low risk feature. It probably has minimum to no impact on the patient, on the product quality or the patient if it goes wrong. So I'm letting the tester, using their knowledge, using their experience, write in what they've done. I still have a pass fail, I still have a performed by, and I still have my cross reference back to my to my requirements. But again, it depends on risk. I mean, thinking back to, again, let's look at the user manual. This could have been like your scenario here for user manual could be verify version 4 of the user manual is correct and is available. You know, like I don't need to tell the test how to do this. That's going to be my test. I want them to test this. Here's my acceptance criteria, but I let them decide how they want to test it. Okay, and again, you can see the benefits of that in terms of document generation, speed, and go-to-market time as well. So let's go on to the next one here, which is the summary. We just summarize the risk-based CSA validation. Again, so we start here in the bottom left-hand corner, is you scale the level of vendor audit to the application. Again, if I'm buying in a very high-risk feature, a very high-risk system, buying in a system that is very high risk and has high-risk features in it, I'm going to leverage my, I'm going to scale the level of vendor audit basically to that particular risk associated with that system. And you leverage testing by the vendor to scale the validation effort. What I mean here is that don't reinvent the wheel. If the vendor has done the testing, your audit might be just go in to verify that you're happy with the level of testing. If you were, don't retest again. You don't really get anything other than a kind of a warm fuzzy feeling that we've done it, but have we done it correctly and how many weeks has that taken us? So then we go risk-based validation. So you scale the validation activities based on the risk, as we mentioned earlier. We have leverage vendor audits. I can't emphasize that enough. Vendor audits are going to be very important with CSA. It's going to take up a lot of your time depending on how many systems you bring in from a vendor, but well worth doing well. And you're looking at the system risk versus risk-based features. Again, I'm testing appropriately to the level of risk based on the features and based on the system. And the last part then is unscripted and ad hoc testing. So all functionality is tested, but only high-risk functionality requires your traditional scripted testing. So you utilize unscripted and ad hoc techniques for low or medium risk. And the last part I can't emphasize enough is unscripted testing does not equal no documentation. You cannot identify something as a low risk feature and say, we didn't bother testing it. Use the ad hoc approach, let the tester write in how they tested it. Okay, so we'll just go through leveraging some of the other activities after this. So we're going to talk about scaling the assurance, which is leveraging other activities. So the first one is activates people and establish processes that provide control in production. So such activities include data integrity, software quality assurance process provided by other organization units. What has a vendor, for example, done for me? So which leads on to the next one, which is leverage testing by the vendor. So establishing purchasing controls processes for selecting and monitoring software developers. Essentially, that means that we're going to look at what the vendor has done. We're going to take what they've done. If we're happy with what they've done, we're going to bring that in as our objective evidence, essentially, and our verification activities as well. So if they've got a URS, if they've got a functional specification, do we necessarily need to rewrite that functional specification? We probably don't, because it's going to cost us time and money to basically rewrite everything again. So the next one is output verification. So additional process controls that have been incorporated through the production. An example here would be, say, for example, I have a system that, it's on a production line, it feeds into the next point in the production line. Okay, if I'm going to check something in the next step in the process or 2 steps down, do I need to validate it at this particular stage of what I'm doing in terms of the system that I'm bringing in? Okay, look up and down the production, look up and down the process before you decide what you need to validate as part of the actual system itself. Okay, the data and information, so the data and information periodically continuously collected by the software for the purposes of monitoring, detecting issues and anomalies in the software after implementation of the software. Again, you just want to make sure that the data is continuously collected and that you have some sort of way to make sure that it's done, periodic reviews example. Okay, the use of CSV tools, bug trackers, automated testing for the assurance of software use in production. Use them whenever possible. The FDA don't plan to go after people for using automated software tools, for example. It's not their job. They want to make sure that you've assessed it enough to make sure you have a level of confidence that the tool works correctly for you. And the use of testing done in iterative cycles, say for example, agile, and use that as part of your software lifecycle so that you can stand over and you're confident that it can be used as part of the quality system and that it helps you make sure that your system is validated. So just go here now quickly into the benefits of digital validation for CSA. So, a paperless validation system should automate the validation software lifecycle process, and it should lead to, the elimination of inefficiencies. Say, for example, moving pages around to get manually signed. Let's look at electronic system that can do that. It ensures consistency of compliance to SOPs and appropriate regs. Again, am I making sure that I'm using the same validation approach, the same templates, for example? Cycle time reductions in reviews and executions. Again, let's take, for example, I'm filling out something electronically. I'm putting in a pass-fail electronically. I'm not writing it in. Again, I'm going to send it out for review. If I do it electronically, I can send it to everybody at the same time. If I'm sending it for review, I have to send it to one individual if it's on pen and paper, which is a real waste of time. So data integration and safe and secure storage of generated data. Again, let's put it this way: if I'm storing something, I'm not storing it on pen and paper. I'm storing it somewhere in a database that I can easily access that data as and when I need to. Electronic traceability matrix reduction in time it takes to generate this artifact. My own personal bugbear when I was a validation engineer was the trace matrix. It took so long to generate it. Whereby an electronic system, the benefits of digital validation is that electronic system should automatically generate that trace matrix for you, which saves a huge amount of time. It just saves an awful lot of time. The integration and validation of the change management process. So again, can you bring both processes into your digital validation system? In Kneat, for example, you can create a process for change management and document it all in one place. The cost reductions for printing, storage, and generated paper records, which we've talked about earlier. We've got increased quality because there's less chance of ad hoc additions on electronic systems. So I can't go in and slide in a page if I need to in the paper record, which I can't do in electronic system. And the scalability of the system in order to add new software systems or sites, for example. So a system that you buy, a digital validation system should be scalable, and it should be easily scalable by you as the owner. I mean, you shouldn't have to go back to somebody constantly and say, I need to put in a new process here. How do I do this? Or can you do it for me? You should be able to use it enough. And instant access to validation artifacts in the event of an audit. An electronic system should allow for instant retrieval of validation records in the event of an audit. We've all gone to cupboards, opened the cupboard, one or two records aren't there, then you're in trouble. Whereas electronic systems should cover all that for you. So what we do know is we very briefly go through an example of Fuji Bio, where they deployed Kneat, the Kneat system, electronic validation system, essentially. And we'll just go through some of the benefits of what they've seen. So this is just a case study, and this is available on Kneat's website. So this is global SAP and HANA deployment. So essentially, it was Fuji Bio came in, they said we needed a digital solution. They had so many different solutions across their organizations that they decided that they want one single solution for everything. So they needed to look at their EMEA, their North America, Europe, Asia, and EMEA, and they wanted to use a CSV solution. They wanted to use a solution where they could implement their CSV process. So what they wanted to do essentially was that once they deployed their SAP HANA deployment in that particular area, what they saw was a 35% reduction versus paper-based validation, a 17% faster speed to market, and 30 sites rapidly deployed. Now that's deploying your digital solution across 30 sites, which, if we all go back to our own experiences, it can take time to deploy anything in a site. So 30 sites being rapidly deployed is quite a speedy thing. Now, I think COVID, to be honest with you, brought electronic validation to people's forefront a lot. The inability to go to someone's desk to drop off a piece of paper to sign to review, I think that hit people a lot during COVID. And I think that was the kind of trigger for a lot of companies to start investigating this further. Okay. So what they do is, prior to deployment, HCL Lifecycles Validation Specialists, they analyze both SAP S/4HANA's CSV requirements and their existing customers' procedures. And before drawing on their best practice knowledge base in HCL Lifecycles and Centre of Excellence to develop and map an efficient risk-based computer software assurance work process in line with FDA thinking. So that's essentially what they did. They took the processes that were there, they looked at the CSA approach that was coming down the road, and they developed their own process and deployed that process in Kneat. So again, you can see here they had the analyze, plan, design, build, test, and deploy phase, which in terms of GAMP it creates the concept, project, operation, and retirement. So you can see here that they've 4 phases followed the GAMP 5 guidelines, which therefore made sure that they were following the kind of CSA planned approach. So again, with a strong focus on efficient risk reductions, New CSA lifecycle leverage HCL's test cycle automation platform and HCL1 test automation suite. A scripting-free environment for automated load and scalability testing, enabling automation and testing to commence much earlier in the product project lifecycle, reducing overall validation and time effort. So essentially what they did was they took this, again, you can see here, this is your traditional scripting tested. They looked at the particular ones that they needed for high risk. They used those within Kneat to record the actual result, the pass, fail, the signature. And then for the ad hoc and for the unscripted testing, they followed that approach then for the lower and medium risk features. Okay, so just in terms of Kneat, then a bit more detail, HCL created a dedicated workspace for the customer within its own Kneat instance. So therefore the customer could go in and do their validation efforts in there. HCL authored all the templates required for validation. So they now use a set of general templates across the organization instead of each organization having their own one. And another good point from Kneat, another selling point, is that the validation status reporting, it allows HCL to ensure the customer's required timelines are met or exceeded despite the scale of the project. So we have a reporting capability as well in Kneat, which will tell you, how many documents are approved, how much testing has been completed, etc., and so on and so forth. So again, this is just a way that Kneat helped digitize their particular system and implement CSA as well. So we'll just talk about just so the impact of dealing this. Again, you can see it was a 35% cost reduction, 18% faster critical project paths, 17% faster speed to market, and 30 sites rapidly deployed. I won't go on any further on this. This particular case study is available to view in Kneat if you want to see it. I just thought I'd bring it to your attention. So that's it. That's it for me in terms of CSA. I hope you've got something from the webinar. Again, I'll just go back over the last few bits. Is that I can't emphasize enough is that the regulations aren't changing, and we need to ensure that we adopt the critical thinking approach to make sure we test the appropriate the test features at the appropriate level based on their risk. So thank you very much for your attendance.
Thanks, Darren. That was a great presentation, and I'm sure all our attendees found it interesting and very informative. We just have a question through. Actually, the questions are coming through now. Recording of the presentation will be available in the follow-up email, yes. We will share the presentation also, yeah. You'll get that in the email that will follow the webinar today. Darren, we've a question in about ideas on how to get customers to adopt. If you can speak to that one, or we can respond through email.
Would it be customers to adopt the CSA approach or customers to adopt a digital validation approach? It's really either. I can answer both actually. Like the way we can look at customers to take the CSA approach is it's a kind of a two-pronged approach. One is to the heart and one is to the wallet, right? When I say to the heart is that we're all concerned about the patient, right? We want to make sure that the system that we're bringing in is adequately tested and the high-risk features are adequately tested so that we make sure that there's no risk to the patient, right? No product quality as well, I'd be concerned about that, but our own major risk is to the patient. We want to make sure that, say, for example, the pharma industry I worked in, it was based on stents. We would always concentrate our testing on the cutting and the automatic pass-fail of those stents, right? The other stuff, no, we did it based on risk. That's what we did, but we concentrate now because that was the most important thing to the patient. The other one then, as I said, is the wallet. If I'm only doing my script testing on 5% of the features as an estimate, I'm going to take a lot shorter to generate those test scripts, to dry run those test scripts, versus the unscripted or the ad hoc testing. So that's where I make the savings in terms of cost, time to market, etc. And for some companies, especially when it's a new product, that does require some element of CSA as part of its production or as part of the manufacturing process. That can save you time and get you to market that a little bit quicker, which will help the wallet side of things.
Perfect. Yeah, the question reference to the new CSA, so I think you answered that very well. And lots of people thanking you for the presentation, that it was wonderful. Well done. And if anybody has any more questions, feel free to submit them. I can see them kind of coming through now, but we've kind of covered the main one there on how to adopt or getting customers to adopt. And if there is no more questions to come through, yeah, I think that's pretty much it, Darren, for the moment. So as I say, if anybody else wants to send through a question, feel free to drop us an email and we'll respond to that for you.
Yeah, we'd be more than
Thanks,
happy to help
everybody.
you with more than happy
Yeah,
to help you with
exactly.
more than happy to help you with any questions you have in relation to CSA itself or digitizing your validation approach. Again, any questions you have are more than welcome.
Exactly. Thanks, Darren. Thanks, everyone, for attending today.
Thank you, everyone. Bye now.
Bye.